So my name is Stacy Bridges. I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar in partnership with Green Hill Recovery in North Carolina. We are grateful for you guys joining in with us and being willing to give us your time and your knowledge. So those of you who don't know who Cumberland Heights is, we are in Nashville, Tennessee. We are located just along the Cumberland River on 177 acres. For over 50 years, we've made it our mission to transform lives, giving hope and healing to those affected by alcohol and drug addiction. We have a deep commitment to the ethical implementation of addiction treatment. In our 50-year history, we've developed programs aligned with the principles embedded in the 12 steps. We value honesty, accountability, and transparency in our operations. We offer all levels of care for adult men, women, ranging from detox to outpatient treatment. We also offer adolescent treatment for males aged 14 to 17 at Arch Academy, and we have 2 12-step immersion programs, both men and women Stillwaters. If you'd like to learn more about how we may be of service, please visit our website at cumberlandheights.org or reach out to me directly. Thank you again for joining us today for this webinar. We hope that you'll find this presentation both educational and useful in your individual and group practices. Please utilize the Q&A option for this webinar with any questions you might have throughout this presentation, and we'll be sure that our presenters are able to answer those during or at the end of the presentation. Once the webinar is complete, we'll be sending you an email that will contain all of the resources from this webinar and a link to the course evaluation. This needs to be completed in order for you to receive those CE certificates. These will also come to you via email. If for any reason you do not receive either one of those emails within the first week or so after this presentation, check your spam and junk folder. Sometimes they get caught up in there. If you don't see them there, let me know and I'll make sure that you get what you need. Your feedback's very important to us as it helps us continue to grow and offer support to the treatment community. With all of that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Marcus Shoemate. He is with Green Hill. He's going to tell you a little bit about what they do over there in North Carolina and also introduce you to our presenter today.
My presentation will not be as polished as Stacy's. That was really good. That was like a drug commercial or something. It's perfect. Yeah, so we are transitional living for 18 to 27-year-old males. Sometimes we go a little bit older than that, sometimes a little bit younger. We primarily working with guys with substance use issues and mental health that are looking to return to school, find a meaningful career, get started on some sort of meaningful path. Very clinically intensive program based in Raleigh, North Carolina, few-minute walk to NC State campus. And our whole ethos and spirit is we don't think not using substance is simply enough, but recovery is much more about what it is that you can get from it. So for us, we really believe in front loading the recovery process and getting guys back involved in life in a really meaningful way to give their recovery process some actual stake. We want them to have investment and buy-in. If a guy leaves our program and all he is someone that's not using substances, then we've dropped the ball, we've screwed up. We want our guys to be totally prepped for the most meaningful life they could possibly build. So we love working with Cumberland Heights. It's like one of our favorite programs to try to utilize and refer to, and we've deeply value that partnership. So when we got the chance to present, it was a no-brainer for us. So I'll shut up and I'll say this, that we're going to let Casey Miller take it off. He's one of our clinicians at Green Hill, very fluid in the acceptance commitment therapy model. And I'm legitimately excited about this presentation as a clinician because I think it has actual value to it. So the one thing that I will say is I'll be monitoring the chat box. And if you want to drop questions in as they go, we're going to save the last 15 minutes and we'll have more of an open dialogue answering those questions sort of session there at the end. So if you have questions, drop them in, comments, anything, drop them in. I'll be monitoring it as we go, and this should be really good. So Casey, take it away.
Hello, everybody. My name is Casey Miller. I've been a therapist at Green Hill for almost a year now, but I've served in some other roles here as well. I did my clinical internship in social work graduate school here, and then I was a case manager here. And so I'm really happy to be doing this. And in the spirit of ACT and being like aware of the present moment. Definitely feel nervous because this is also one of my, well, this is my first time giving a CEU presentation. So just wanted to share vulnerably. And also that a really nice function of Zoom that I'm noticing is that I can't actually see any participants. So it feels like I'm just presenting to some people that I already know, which makes this a little bit easier. And to what Marcus's point about Green Hill recovery, I was actually doing a group this morning that feels kind of connected to this presentation, where we were talking about like setting goals and ambivalence about being sober. And some people had a hard time imagining being sober and like, well, you know, wanting to be sober. And there's this concept in ACT that I really resonate with. It's probably not for everybody, but the idea of a dead man's goal, and that setting a goal that a corpse can do better than you is probably not going to like take you very far or to like a very fulfilling life. And so I think that that's something that's like very ACT oriented, is like being in touch with like, what do you actually want from life, as opposed to like, what do you want to get rid of or not be doing, whether it's substances or anxiety. So I don't know, I just thought I would kind of share that concept. It's one of my favorite things. I'm going to set a timer for myself so that I can be efficient. All right. Let me share the screen real quick. Sorry. It's in full screen. Here we go. Technical difficulties. Okay, are y'all seeing this in full screen?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so acceptance and commitment therapy, also known as ACT therapy, is in trauma. That's kind of the subject that we're going to be going into today. My main hope for this is that this piques your interest into ACT therapy, and you know, kind of gives you a different way of looking at things that your clients may struggle with, and maybe adjusting, you know, if you've have someone that you've struggled with, that kind of adopting some of these mindsets might be helpful for you and your clients. I like this quote: from an ACT perspective, the core of psychopathology and human unhappiness is inflexibility. And I think where this, as therapists, like our sort of, I see our big job as trying to help the people that we're working with respond more flexibly to their life's context. And where a lot of pathology comes in, and ACT as a very non-pathological therapy model, a lot of pathology comes in as like inflexible responses to different difficulties that show up in life. And so life is very unpredictable. It's very contextually based, you know, different strategies and different ways that we go about our life apply, and they're useful or not useful in different situations. So ACT is geared towards helping people respond more accurately to the context that they're in. So throughout this presentation, are you all seeing a picture of Dr. House? So throughout this presentation, I have examples of some popular characters I think that represent some of the concepts that we're going to be going through. And this is also a very ACT thing, is kind of picking out, oftentimes heroes is a concept that ACT uses. So finding heroes in your life that represent different values and qualities that you find to be helpful for the struggles that you go through. So I thought that Dr. House was kind of a perfect example of somebody who has an extremely inflexible life. He is, a generally unlikable person, uses drugs, can't take other people's perspectives, is kind of a narcissist. So he's sort of an example of maybe the type of inflexibility that we're thinking about. And also notably, he's somebody, if you haven't watched the show, he has some pretty serious trauma in his life. This kind of succinct definition of acceptance and commitment therapy, it's an evidence-based therapeutic approach targeting the verbal problem solving that gets in the way of having a flexible, rich, and varied life. And I don't know how much exposure to ACT materials you all have, but this verbal problem solving aspect is really at the core of ACT. And what that means, and a lot of the materials in the ACT world can get kind of in the weeds with some technical psychological lingo type stuff. But basically, our minds and the ways that we try to solve things from a more logical perspective can get in the way of actually having a very responsive and flexible lifestyle. So one metaphor that I've heard for this is your mind is like a don't get killed machine. And what that machine is good for is answering questions like, if I were to ask you all right now, and you can imagine this, I would encourage you all to just sort of imagine what the answer to this would be, is what would you do if there was a fire in the kitchen right now? And you can sit there and think for a minute. And, we can probably come up with some good ideas. It's like calling 911. That's probably a good option. But maybe you have a fire extinguisher. Maybe you have some pets or children in the house. Maybe you have some beloved items that you would want to save. That's what the mind is pretty good for. It's not going to be perfect, but you can probably figure out how to respond to a fire being in your kitchen right now. Now, if I were to ask you, I'm going to ask you another question, and this is kind of what the problem-solving mind, the verbal problem-solving mind is not so good at. How do you cope with the loss of the things that you love? And while some things probably come to mind, what's coming to mind is probably experiences of loss and coping and healing and growth that you've had in your life. But if you were to try to describe or make a formula to tell somebody about what they should do, it's not so simple as saying you should call 911 when there's a fire in your house. So the way that we kind of deal with this dilemma in ACT is through, it's a behavioral therapy, is through mindfulness practice or awareness. I think mindfulness is kind of can be a term that some people don't like, but building awareness, flexible attention, it's a behavioral model. So we're really focused on behavioral change and behavioral learning. And it's a cognitive model. So we look at thoughts and we look at some of the same kind of thought patterns that, maybe some of the more well-known models like CBT take a look at. It's also process-based. So what that means and is that ACT is actually like much less focused on symptom reduction or symptoms than many other models. And so that's what I was kind of referring to in terms of the dead man's goal, is like we may have someone that comes in and says like, I want to get rid of my PTSD, or I really want to get rid of my anxiety, or I want to get rid of my depression. And it's like, okay, so what happens when we do that? The symptom reduction on its own is not necessarily, is that going to give someone a meaningful life? So what we want to do is encourage processes that actually encourage people to live meaningful lives. And then this experiential aspect, that goes back to that question of how do you cope with the loss of the things that you love? Well, our initial learning when we're in infancy, it's all experiential. Before we create that verbal problem solving, like we learn how to walk, we learn how to build relationships experientially. And so that we're trying in ACT to kind of stimulate some of that same experiential learning on how to actually move through life's difficulties, as opposed to trying to create some sort of formula such as, call 911, gather my pets, and get out of the house. Okay. So ACT, some of the underlying beliefs in ACT is that there are 6 core yearnings. And these are the things that really all people seek in their life. These are sort of the building blocks of being a human, and the things that everybody wants. And from this perspective, suffering comes from ineffective attempts at fulfilling these 6 core yearnings. So we have, I'll just kind of go through and define these briefly. Coherence and understanding. Everybody wants to be able to make sense of things. That things make sense within the context of our lives. We become deeply unsettled as people when something doesn't make sense within the set of understanding that we've been taught or have grown in. Everybody wants belonging. I think, us as therapists, like we understand that. We're social beings. Competence, that's a huge one. It's being able to feel like I have the power, my actions, I can exert energy and have some sort of effect that I desire through that energy. Self-directed meaning, that I have the autonomy and power of choice to direct my life the way that I want it to go. That's not, not without blips or difficulties, but move in a general direction. Orientation, and this one maybe isn't quite as clear as some of the other ones, but orientation is an understanding of the past, present, and future in context, being oriented to the present moment, and how that stems from the past and how it informs the future. And then feeling, all humans want to feel. Sometimes that gets disrupted, as we'll see. We'll talk about that. But all humans want to feel. And I think where a lot of psychopathology comes from is humans are really prone to trying to seek attempts at fulfilling these that are actually very short-term oriented and long-term create problems. So, okay, the example for this one, this is one of my favorite albums, Beyonce's Lemonade. And the reason, I don't know, when I was kind of going through this process of trying to come up with examples that capture some of these ideas, I thought this was a really beautiful album. If you haven't already listened to it, she really goes through like the complexity and the gray areas of life, and kind of savoring pain as also a source of being able to know what you really care about, working through insecurity, identity. So I just thought this was kind of an example of an unapologetic exploration of the core yearnings and the pain that comes with not having them met. So I thought this was a really wonderful quote about trauma, that this was actually in a practice therapy session that Steve Hayes, one of the founders of acceptance and commitment therapy, demonstrated. He says, when I hear the word trauma, to me, that means pain, plus I can't have that pain. We can do something about trauma. We may not be able to do something about pain. And really, would you want to? And he says this to a client in session who's going through some really difficult grief. And I thought that this was just, particularly the last part, we may be able to do something about pain. We may not be able to do something about pain. And really, would you want to? And I thought that that was just such a beautiful encapsulation of really effective trauma work, because I think getting rid of pain as a goal, pain really shows us what we care about. Oftentimes, if we are getting rid of pain, then really we're getting rid of much more than just the pain. So the example I have for that, I'm sure we've all seen Inside Out, such a good group therapy resource if you've never shown it. And there's this beautiful moment where Sadness is talking to the imaginary friend Bing Bong, rest in peace, who is, and this character Joy is, kind of like really invalidating of Sadness and her usefulness. And then in this moment, like Sadness is sitting and empathizing with this very devastated character. And they have this deep connection. And that, sadness is something that is not to be gotten rid of. Pain is something that's not to be gotten rid of. It's something to be tended to carefully, held delicately. So I have a video that I want to show. So I'm going to share a different screen.
It often seems like we've got a struggle switch at the back of our mind. And as soon as an uncomfortable emotion, a painful feeling or memory shows up, it's like the struggle switch goes on and we start to struggle with it. So let's suppose anxiety shows up. A very common painful emotion that we all get to experience. Anxiety shows up, the struggle switch goes on. Oh, here's anxiety. I don't like anxiety. I want to get rid of my anxiety. Now I've got anxiety about my anxiety. So it's getting bigger. With the struggle switch on, I now get, oh, my anxiety is getting bigger. How do I get rid of my anxiety? Now I've got even more anxiety. With the struggle switch on, I may then get angry about my anxiety. Why does this anxiety keep showing up? I hate this anxiety. Then I might even start to feel sad about my anger. Oh, is this my life? Oh, and then I may start to feel guilty about my sadness about my anger. Oh, how pathetic am I when there's starving kids in Africa? So with my struggle switch on, my emotions get amplified. I've now got guilt about my sadness, about my anger, about my anxiety, And that kind of amplification of emotions gives them more impact and influence over my life, and often gets me bogged down or pulls me into self-defeating behaviors. Now, what happens if I can switch off the struggle switch? With the struggle switch off, anxiety shows up, and it's not that I like it or want it or approve of it, it's just I'm not going to struggle with it. I'm not going to invest my time, energy, and effort in struggling with this anxiety. Instead, I'm going to invest it in doing meaningful, life-enhancing activities, such as spending quality time with my friends and family or playing with my kids. Now, with the struggle switch off, the anxiety is free to move. It may get higher, it may get lower, it may move quickly, it may move slowly, but the point is it's free to move. It doesn't get amplified by all of these other emotions which make it kind of bigger and stickier and make it hang around for a lot longer. So there's no such thing as a life without anxiety. It shows up for all of us. But when anxiety shows up and the struggle switch is off, it's so much easier to live with than when the struggle switch is on.
Okay. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. I think maybe a downside from this not being able to see the crowd is I can't see any reactions from anybody. I'm gonna guess that no reaction means I can be heard right now.
No, they can.
All right. So the struggle switch, as you can see from this video, I think that touches on something very similar to the trauma equals pain plus I can't have that pain. And that as opposed to as opposed to trying to focus in trauma treatment or treating clients who have some kind of traumatic experience or identify as having trauma in their lives, as opposed to necessarily trying to reduce distress or pain, our focus would then be more on reducing the struggle, the I can't have that pain part. Now, of course, I want to kind of add a disclaimer here. I think there are a lot of different ways of looking at trauma, a lot of different ways that trauma affects people's lives. So I definitely don't mean that there's any one way of looking at trauma, and what actually focuses on is what's useful for the person, and what's useful for the person to live their best life, essentially. So if someone is having panic attacks, or if someone is having intense flashbacks, or there's just so much pain that like some of these conversations or some of this work wouldn't even be possible, then of course it's probably going to be useful to try to reduce some of that activation pain level. So I do want to kind of clarify that for this. So going back to ACT as a process-based therapy, as opposed to targeting the pain itself, which is kind of just a core reality of life, is that pain exists. ACT is going to target the processes that we get into. So I can't have that pain is more of a process within ourselves. It's going to target these processes that end up creating quote unquote trauma. There are many ways to apply ACT to treating trauma. Typically what I've seen is not particularly manualized. I would imagine that there are some studies on more of a, kind of a cut and dry, like sequential ACT type therapy. But as you'll see, ACT is oftentimes more responsive to just what processes are present in this person's life. And so the ultimate aim is to build capacity for a flexible, rich, values-driven life. Going back to those initial slides of building flexibility is the goal. And with all that said, oftentimes there are studies that suggest and indicate that painful symptoms are often reduced. And it's definitely possible. But we intentionally want to take the focus off of reducing the pain or the anxiety and onto how can we help you and create some different processes where you can live the life that you want to be living. So here's a quote: "If we don't like peeling paint, we can scrape the wall and put on a fresh coat. But conversely, if we don't like thinking of a past trauma and try to scrape it away, we may make it more central, salient, and influential. If we fear a future drought, we might save water to quench our future thirst. But if we fear future rejection and try to make sure no one will ever hurt us in that way again, we may limit our connections with others or avoid making commitments, thus amplifying the role of rejection in our lives." And so, as I'm sure, so I'm guessing some of you are thinking, I'll just say something that I'm thinking right now as I'm reading this, is that I feel like this quote kind of captures the way that ACT actually, there's a lot of overlap with other models of therapy and other views of psychopathology that, so for instance, if we fear a future drought, we might save water to quench our future thirst. That's a very verbal problem solving type of way of doing things. But if we fear future rejection and try to make sure no one will ever hurt us again in that way, we may limit our connections. I can see how this could fit into kind of a core belief mindset. This could fit into more of a psychodynamic approach. So I think, ACT is very applicable to other ways of looking at things. ACT is also very big on metaphors, and creating kind of imagery for people is a way that can help people remember concepts better. So one metaphor that I really like about ACT therapy in general is that, if you were to imagine that you were in your house in the dark by yourself, and you put on the scariest movie you can think of, which I remember doing this as a child when I was like 11, watching The Exorcist. I don't know, I have good parents, but I don't know why that happened. And I was horrified, and I ended up having to turn it off. But now if you were to imagine that this same scary movie is on, The Exorcist is on, all the lights are on, you're knitting, you've got some really good food cooking on the stove, you have some friends over, the windows are open, there's a nice breeze, and the movie's still on, but you're living your life. The Exorcist isn't going to be quite as scary. It's not going to really matter quite as much that that's on the TV. And so that's sort of a goal of how ACT might work. So this hero right here, this is kind of an example of where I can see the inflexibility process come in around trauma. Ron Swanson has kind of this really comedic repeat of traumatic relationships with women named Tammy. And there's this moment in the show where he has this shift to a different way of reacting to these relationships that he's been in, where the Tammys in his life they're all having a drinking contest, and Ron decides that he wants to protect his friend Leslie Knope from these painful people from his life. And it's this moment where he kind of like sheds himself of this intense avoidance of ever standing up to his Tammy trauma. And I realize I'm making light of trauma in a certain way here, but I also think that, again, these are examples of, metaphorically, I think that these can help you remember some of these concepts. All right, so now we're getting right into the real meat of things. ACT has this, I'll show you, there's this shape called the Hexaflex, which I think is kind of a silly name. But this is a diagram that ACT uses to kind of conceptualize a lot of the things that we will be working with. So these core inflexibility processes match up with, if you'll remember, those core yearnings. So cognitive fusion, that's one of them, and that's a huge target for acceptance and commitment therapy. And fused thinking, and we'll get more into this, is the attempt of the mind to build coherence and understanding. And so what fused thinking looks like, it's oftentimes very much oriented towards truth and rules and kind of objectivity, and it's very inflexible, it's fused. Attachment to the conceptualized self. This is an attempt at belonging. And again, I'll remind you all, a lot of these are attempts at fulfilling these yearnings, but they're oftentimes very much more short-term oriented. So it might give you a short-term sense of belonging or coherence or any of the other ones, but it tends to leave us feeling dissatisfied long-term. And so attachment to the conceptualized self, this is oftentimes when people are making statements and have a very kind of like rigid view of who they are, and that's an attempt at belonging. I'll move on. Inaction, impulsivity, and avoidant persistence. So this is our attempt at meeting our yearning for competence. And when we look at inaction, impulsivity, avoidant persistence, there is a lot of, I think there's a lot of fear around competence and being inactive or being impulsive, as opposed to being committed and striving for moving in a certain direction, means that we never have to face the fact that our competence is sometimes shaken. Lack of contact with chosen values. ACT is huge on values. That's an attempt at meeting this core yearning, self-directed meaning. But as we'll see, on one side of the coin is values, and on the other side is pain, because sometimes we don't live by our values. Sometimes we have our values compromised by others. Inflexible attention is an attempt at meeting the yearning of orientation. The way this oftentimes shows up is fixating on the past and future, attempting to predict and kind of correct past difficulties. And then experiential avoidance. And this is an attempt at meeting the yearning of feeling. And this is one that I find particularly fascinating, where our yearning is to just feel broadly. But what the problem-solving mind, when that can come in, is that it can attempt to only feel pleasure, and in an attempt to only feel pleasure, people quickly find that the only way to not feel bad about stuff is to not feel anything, because pleasure is impermanent. So this graphic that we use, you can see all of these are each one of these inflexibility processes is connected to all the others. And in ACT therapy, I think something that's really wonderful about it, as I'm learning more about it, is that somebody might come into your office with really strong experiential avoidance as a result of trauma, feeling anything at all, maybe too much. It's a really scary prospect. And so this is connected to all of the other processes. Where ACT, I think, can be really wonderful is that maybe experiential avoidance is kind of at the core of what's causing this person issues, but maybe it's just so delicate that it's really hard to go into. So we might actually want to approach things from a cognitive fusion standpoint and try to loosen things up there. But sort of secondarily, it opens up a little bit more space for some more feeling experience. And then we can maybe we can target values, and maybe that opens up a little more space for someone to have a little bit more feelings come in. So that's kind of a way of understanding the importance of this diagram. I think this is kind of the last inflexible model that we have. Walter White, I won't go into all the ways that he's terrible, but he's somebody that I think one that comes to mind in particular is this avoidant persistence. I think there are numerous times in Breaking Bad where he kind of has these moments where he's in touch with his values, but it's just like too much to feel, and so he just kind of persists on in this pathway that he's of destruction that he's set. And so the counter, or the sort of flip side of these inflexibility processes, are the flexibility processes. So as you'll see as I go deeper into these, there's the concept of the pivot in acceptance and commitment therapy. So where each of the inflexibility processes, there's kind of a pivot point where we're not necessarily trying to invalidate these processes, but it's just sort of a little shift of the energy to become a process of flexibility in life. So defusion is sort of an untethering of these rules and truth that people can kind of build in order to have coherence and understanding. I was just doing some of this work with clients in group earlier, and one of my favorite interventions in this regard is, when people have difficult thoughts about themselves, or kind of self-defeating beliefs about themselves. So for myself, I frequently, if we were to go from a core beliefs standpoint, competence. That's something that I feel some struggle around. And so, if I have the thought like, oh, I'm incompetent, just a real simple intervention that I think can do a lot for people is just adding a except when I'm not to their statement. So I'm incompetent except when I'm not. So it's not so much acceptance and commitment therapy, especially around thoughts. We tend to not do things the way that like CBT might, in terms of kind of looking for evidence to the contrary, but it's just sort of creating some distance from that, the temperature of that belief, so to speak. Flexible perspective taking. So this is the ability to shift and view things from different perspectives. And this can be very hard, especially like when someone's oh, I see a typo. I had orientation there. I believe that, let's see, what's the core yearning for this one? Belonging, I believe. So this is an attempt to meet belonging, yearning. And as we've seen, when people have some effects of trauma in their life, oftentimes there can be some like rigid senses of self that come about from that, whether it's a sense of self that's I'm weak, or if it's one that's more of a kind of defensive, protective posture of I'm not a people person. Heard that one before. And this flexible perspective taking is hoping to like kind of massage a little bit of flexibility in that, to be able to remember like, oh, well, I used to see things in a different way, or someone else probably, being able to take the perspective of like of the therapist, bringing the therapeutic relationship into it. Committed action. This is kind of the crux, or maybe end goal of a lot of acceptance and commitment therapy is the work that we're doing actually making a difference in this person's life from a behavior perspective? And so, is the person that we're working with able to say like, I'm going to do this, and maybe it's going to be hard, but I'm going to give it my best. Connection to values. This is something that I'm sure we've all seen, but this connecting to your values can be very hard when you feel like your values have been rocked by something traumatic happening, and particularly when I think this self-directed aspect of your life has been maybe taken from you, from whether it's another person or the environment, or societal norms, the structures in your life. So it can be kind of difficult to actually take a look at, how do my values maybe, what role do they serve in my life? What do I want for myself? Flexible attention to the now. So this is kind of a fancy way of saying being present. Being able to, the way that this I think can oftentimes show up with trauma, is being aware of body sensations in the moment, emotions in the moment, being able to observe thoughts, being able to be present. I think, in the DSM, one of the things that we see is hypervigilance as a part of PTSD. And I think flexible attention to the now can be very difficult when the present does not feel safe. And acceptance, feeling. As I said earlier, with trauma, with traumatic experiences, with the effects of that, real flexible feeling means you're going to feel a lot of different things. If you want to feel joy, that means there needs to be space for sorrow. And that can be kind of a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people when there's been a lot of the difficult stuff. So this is the same diagram, but just from the flexibility standpoint. And the example that I had for this, I don't know if anybody's seen Sex Education. Highly recommend the show. There's therapists in it, which I always find interesting to see how therapists are in media. But this character's name is Eric, and there's just this wonderful moment in the show where he, I guess it's sort of like their prom, and Eric shows up in this just amazing, beautiful outfit and totally fully capturing his gender expression and culture and sexuality, and just showing it to the whole school and receiving just this wonderful reception from his family and others, and just a really triumphant moment where, you know, it's kind of symbolizing him working through a lot of the stuff that he struggled with in the show. Okay, so this quote I thought was really wonderful. If suffering alone taught, all the world would be wise, since everyone suffers. To suffering must be added mourning, understanding, patience, love, openness, and the willingness to remain vulnerable. So this is, you know, I think kind of a sell for acceptance and commitment therapy, and maybe for a selling point for, you know, pain alone, suffering alone is not the goal of feeling, but it has to be part of a bigger picture, the fuller, kind of rounder experience of feeling and connecting and understanding, as she says. And the example, you know, I think this is more of a movement as a symbol or a metaphor, but an example that I thought of for this was around the movement for Black Lives and the collective mourning for Breonna Taylor and others, that incorporates this understanding and the mourning and an acknowledgement that this pain is not enough, and that the collective sadness is not enough, and taking the difficult stance of saying, you know, we have different values, and we want something more. All right, so in these sections, I'm going to go through each of the inflexibility processes, as well as the kind of flexibility pivot that we're working with. And then, as you'll see in parentheses at the top, I have the core yearning that's in there. And I've included quotes on either side of the pivot that kind of capture the type of things that you may hear clients say that sort of might be like I don't know, an alarm bell that you're hearing some fusion or any of these other processes show up. So to start, fusion, as I said, this is where the verbal problem-solving mind, it likes to, it wants coherence. We as humans, we want coherence. And the way that it oftentimes attempts to achieve that is by creating these like fused relationships and kind of networks of ideas in our mind. So, for instance, like core beliefs, that's an example of a fused thought. You know, a core belief that I have worked with is, if we were to kind of diagram this, is me, like Casey, equals incompetence. And so if I were to, anytime I think of, maybe not anytime, but you know, if I think of Casey, then that means like incompetence. If you can kind of picture it, it's like, that's you know, those old school like ball and chain. It's like that is just attached to me. It's fused to me. It's almost like a rule that I have in my head. And so ways that I've heard this with clients that have had trauma in their past. And when I say trauma, I also want to specify it's not necessarily just shock trauma or, you know, I've kind of intentionally not included much or actually anything about the DSM diagnosis for PTSD. Not that that's not useful. It certainly is or can be, but kind of in the spirit of ACT, looking more from a depathologizing standpoint. So, you know, I think trauma can exist in a number of different ways in people's lives that doesn't necessarily fit into that DSM structure. So some of the things that I've heard from people before is people can't be trusted, as I said earlier, and this is kind of maybe a mixture of fusion and another inflexibility process is like, I don't like people. I've heard that before. This was working with young people who had been in the foster care system and aged out. So there were some justifiable rules and fused thoughts that had really kind of built in their lives. And another thing is kind of contrary maybe to CBT and some other cognitive models is ACT isn't particularly interested in kind of looking at the truth of things. Because the fact of the matter is, like, some of the people that I worked with, like, their experience was that people can't be trusted. And that was pretty true to them. And, you know, kind of doing an investigation of, well, what evidence is there to the contrary? Could be kind of invalidating to them. Another way of you might hear this is this kind of defense of something being true. I know it isn't helpful, but it's true. You know, I know that something I hear is like, well, you know, I know that this probably isn't true, but it really feels that way. And what we're really focused on is like, is this thought helpful? If you follow this thought, where will it take you in life? If you let this thought guide you, where will it take you? And oftentimes that's not helpful. One way that ACT has been, this is not unrelated to trauma, but one way that ACT has been effective is with patients who are struggling with terminal health diagnosis. So the truth of the matter is, and this, you know, can be a fused thought, is I'm going to die. We can't really do any kind of, you know, investigating the evidence for or against that. But if that's the thought that's guiding you, how useful is that to living a meaningful life while you're alive?
Real quick, Casey, I know we're going to run short on time. So what I want to do is just say that we'll take a few more minutes to go through some of the slides, and we'll send out the slide deck afterwards. But if people have questions now, they can start dropping them in, and we'll take 5 minutes towards the end to answer some of the questions too.
We have till when?
About to need to start wrapping up in about 5.
Oh, I thought we had till 4.
No, you technically have until, well, you have it, yes, until 4 p.m. We blocked out till 4 p.m. your time.
Okay. Oh, okay, good.
Thanks, Marcus. So, okay, I'm going to show another video. This is a really, really helpful video. Oops. And before I share it, it has really bad animation and sound. So, but that'll be okay.
I'm Tom. This is the story of my bus of life. On the journey, I pick up lots of passengers, memories, thoughts, emotions, some pleasant, some not so pleasant. Sometimes handling them can be tricky.
I knew you'd come this way again. Same old, same old.
You're pathetic.
What a grumpy lot. Don't worry, driver, I can sort them out.
Don't even think about going down there.
That way will never work out.
Where's that bus going? It looks exciting.
What do you think you're doing? You think you have what it takes? You'll just fail like last time. Dream on.
What's the point? It's too much work. Why take the risk?
Haha, it's not like it's your choice. This is my bus.
Okay, I'll turn around. Just be quiet.
Listen, let's make a secret deal. You keep doing what you're doing and I'll keep the passengers quiet for you.
Okay then, back to the same old road. Just so you know, I'm not happy about this. I like driving buses, but what I'd really love to do is be a race driver.
Loser, what do you think you're doing?
Better stick to what you know or the deal is off.
Race driver? You're a loser. Stick to driving buses.
Right, that's it. This is my bus. Get off.
Yeah, fight me. Let's see where that gets you. You pathetic excuse for a driver.
Your bus ain't going anywhere now. I don't know why you bother driving.
Hey, what's going on in that bus? Things seem to be happening differently.
You're not allowed to go that way. We've got rules.
Thanks for the feedback, guys, but this is my bus.
Maybe I don't need to get rid of this bunch. They could just come with me for the ride.
Whatever, you're still a loser.
I don't know about this.
No, what about the deal?
Racetrack, that's where I want to go.
See, we told you. What were you thinking?
You could never be a racing driver. Just play it safe.
Hang on tight, guys. Here we go!
Okay. So there is so much in that video. And I just used that in the group earlier. And it seemed to be very impactful with some of my guys. And you know, I think what it captures in the ways that ACT is different than I'll just use CBT as an example because they're kind of easy comparisons. Is it's more focused on making space for the passengers and less you know, direct engagement with them. There's the part where he gets off, or he stops the bus and is kind of getting into a conflict with the big bully. And you know, I think in some cases this can be how some maybe like direct sort of argument with some of these unhelpful thoughts can end up doing, is that while you may get some sort of momentary satisfaction of discounting or sort of, you know, feeling like you're doing something with that thought, but unfortunately your attention is going towards that as opposed to actually driving your bus. Now, again, I'll say that if a CBT intervention is useful for somebody, then that's awesome. But the ACT interventions around diffusion are more geared towards making space for these thoughts. A comparison that a client made in group this morning is that kind of was familiar to him with some of the internal family systems work. So I thought that was interesting to hear. What you might hear from clients that indicate that they have achieved some diffusion, if you've done some diffusion work with them, is I'm noticing a lot of distrustful thoughts as a sort of counter to people can't be trusted. And so where you can kind of see some diffusion, and they built a little bit of distance between themselves and their thoughts, is actually being able to notice that these are thoughts. And it's not just a fact of life that people can't be trusted. You can follow that thought if you want, but also if that's not serving you, creating some distance might help you make a different choice. Another thing you might hear is people can hurt me and I'm still going to try. So this is kind of a counter to that. I know it isn't helpful, but it's true. You know, I'm kind of no longer arguing for the truth of something when it isn't necessarily useful. There's an awareness, there's space for that thought to be there, and I'm still going to live my life. And particularly that last thought, as an example of diffused thinking, this isn't a perfect example, but the person who came to mind is Samwell Tarly from Game of Thrones television series and the book series, who is just overwhelmed by really, really rough thinking about himself, and yet is like such a heroic figure and really follows his values and does things constantly that he doesn't think that he can do. So, you know, I thought he was a good example, and someone that's had a very traumatic experience in Westeros. Anyways, attachment to the conceptualized self. That's another one of these inflexibility processes. This is the attempt at belonging, and humans do a funny thing where we want to belong, which I think by nature means that we want to be, we don't want to be separate from others. You know, that's another way of looking at it. But then the way that our problem-solving mind, that verbal problem-solving mind, attempts to do that is by finding the ways that we are different from others. Whether that means like, I'm a nice person, I'm a smart person, I'm you know, I'm really good at this. And essentially when we're saying that is that we're saying like, I am smarter than some other people. I am, you know, more attractive than some other people. It's a way of sort of like setting ourselves actually apart from the group as opposed to becoming a part of the group. And then when there's pain of trauma, so you know, trauma can really rock the ways that we think about ourselves, whether it's somebody doing it to us or you know, something kind of more coming from the environment. It can really rock that experience of our sense of self. And so you know, maybe counterintuitively what we'll kind of hear like, I'm a weak person, and so setting ourselves apart in this way is kind of I think in some ways a way of lessening the pain of having something like that happen. That it's, you know, I don't belong because I'm weak, not just because you know, something painful happened. Another way that this shows up, like I said earlier, I don't like people. I'm not a people person. That is probably less painful than taking a look at the fact that like, actually I do really want to belong, but it is really hard for me to connect to people because I don't feel safe with people. So these are the types of things that you might hear when someone is kind of attached to a conceptualized version of themselves. It's more of a story. That's where, you know, kind of a question that you might ask somebody when they're saying things about this is, you don't want to invalidate, you know, them by calling it a story, but if you can kind of work up to that, is you know, asking like, oh, you know, so when did this story begin? You know, can you kind of see where the beginning of this story was? Because that in and of itself is a perspective taking of seeing that there's a beginning to this. There was a point where things were not this way. A way that you might hear somebody who has a more flexible perspective taking is use of metaphor. So I'm like a cat with people. I tend to need time to like you. You know, it's a lot different than I don't like people. You know, it's an acknowledgement. There's some self-acceptance in that. There's some understanding of how I fit into the context of life. You know, that I do want people in my life, and maybe I'm a little bit prickly at first. Another way that you might see this is, again, this is kind of the mindfulness part of ACT coming through, is I'm noticing that there's a voice that tells me I'm weak. And so a lot of sort of ACT interventions and ACT language can be a little bit wordy, but it almost like symbolically, that the amount of words between I'm and weak is also symbolically representing the amount of distance maybe between me and this version of myself. So I'm noticing that there's a voice that tells me that I'm weak. It kind of hits a little bit differently than I'm weak. Again, this is another way where we can use that intervention that I said earlier of I'm weak except when I'm not. It's not arguing with that, but sort of taking a look at like, okay, so you're weak. When have you not been weak? And seeing if, somebody can take a look at that. All right, so my example for this, I really love this one. Felt very inspired. I thought of the moment where Darth Vader said, "Luke, I am your father." Where, some of that was just knowledge that was revealed to him. But some of that was also that Darth Vader had taken on this villainous stance as a result of just, terrible trauma and, really painful experiences. And it was no small moment when he was able to take this perspective and remember, like, I am a father. Not only that, my son is right here. And he was able to defend his son from the emperor. So I thought that was a very inspired example on my part. Okay, inaction, impulsivity, or avoidant persistence. This is something that I see a lot in my clients, not all of whom have trauma in their lives, but most or all of whom have some pretty serious struggles with substance use. And there's a lot of different ways that this can show up. Inaction, we see that with lots of different forms of avoidance. I think it's interesting that impulsivity and avoidant persistence come up in this. And particularly this is inaction towards like values, what you really care about. There's kind of this sense maybe that like the person is saying one thing to you about what they care about, but the way that things look on the outside is not really organized around that. And, everybody's imperfect, but there's really a disconnect between what you're hearing from them maybe and what you're seeing from them. I really want to improve my relationship with my parents. But I keep coming every week and saying that I haven't called my parents yet. So there's a number of things that could go through, could be contributing to that, but that may be one thing that looks like. This I can't do it example. This is particularly when, like, if you've worked with a client for a while and you feel pretty confident that they have some skills that they could use in order to live more flexibly, like to have, like, they have skills within the therapy room that would translate to being able to change their life in certain ways. But there's still this kind of like persistent, like, I can't do it. Not gonna, I don't think I can do that. Also, if you're somebody that gives clients homework, this sort of like, I didn't do it, I just forgot. You know, kind of, that's probably, you know, it could be, again, a sign of some other things, but this is an example of where, like, you know, it's not that it's homework that's going to be particularly like activating for them, but for whatever reason, they just, like, you know, they didn't commit to it. So the pivot there is committed action. Part of the name of acceptance and commitment therapy, committed, where you'll see moments of this as, and clients are usually pretty eager to report this, as, you know, they did their homework. They followed through on something that they said that they would. They're like reporting things to you that are changes in their behaviors. And also, I think a committed action is like this: I'm scared, but I'm willing to follow through. It's an acknowledgement of difficulty, an acknowledgement of what's coming up in the present moment when they think about it. But also a willingness and maybe a commitment to actually do it. You know, I have space for that. I have the capacity to do this, even though I'm feeling a certain way about it. Just want to check to make sure I'm okay. Let's see. A way that you'll also see this is, you know, this avoidant persistence is, you know, the pattern of commit, slip, give up. And then where we want to try to help clients get to with this work is commit, slip. Slips are inevitable with habits, with new behavior forming, and then recommit. So commit, slip, commit. An example that came for me was Leslie Knope from Parks and Recreation, who, you know, by no means is somebody that doesn't have any of these inflexibility processes, but I don't think anybody could argue that she isn't committed to following through on what she said she would. Lack of contact with chosen values and self-directed meaning. This can show up as kind of apathy sometimes, which, you know, can be differentiated from, you know, maybe like a clinical depression, but, you know, sort of any questions about like the future, what do you care about, or not necessarily future, but miracle question kind of questions. You know, the answer can kind of fall flat. You know, I don't know what I care about. Another way that you might see this is when you ask somebody about what they care about or what they value, what they give you is more goals or achievements, or, you know, kind of like external changes. I just need to get a job and move to a new place. I was like, well, you know, this is a follow-up question. Well, then what? You know, what would change about that? What would be better? But you can also find, you can probably, you know, kind of massage out what it is that a person cares about in there. I think also like the pain that a client feels, the struggles that they're having can be a really, really strong indicator of what they care about. They might not feel it that way, but if you feel a lot of pain in your relationship with your mother, then there's probably something in there that you care about. Otherwise, it wouldn't hurt so bad. And particularly when we look at values from the ACT perspective, it's actionable. It's something that is more of like a how you want to live. It's something. So in this example of, I want to be a loving father. You know, being loving. That is something that you know, it's like, if this is a value to me, like I can bring this into my actions in so many different ways. And nobody can really take that from me. my independence is so important to me. This is something that I see in a lot of my clients who are young men. Independence as a strong value, and doing values work can be painful, because admitting that you really care about something can mean facing that this has been compromised for you in the past, or you haven't lived up to it in the past. This is Kenneth Parcell from 30 Rock. Thought he was a very valued, driven person in this show. He's, kind of laughably innocent, but has sort of this unshakable value system. Inflexible attention. This is a lot of thinking about the past and future. So, again, this can show up as goals, needs, shoulds. I just need to work out more, probably eat better too. A lot of fixation on these kinds of thoughts. When you're in session with them, there can be sort of this feeling of like they're not actually there with you, like you're almost just an audience for their internal monologue. I don't know what I'm feeling right now. She can be such a fill in the blank. So this is, you might ask a client, like, sort of calling them into the present moment. What are you feeling right now as you say this, or as you think about this? And this can show up as like a real difficulty of being able to say or identify or name like a present moment experience. I think this can show up a lot in trauma. Real difficulty being present within the body, when the body is maybe not necessarily feel like a safe place to be, when the present moment in the past has been unsafe. So this can be a real difficult area with people that have experienced some trauma. The kind of pivot, it is trying to work on like being able to just notice the present, notice things. Practice around this can, we do so many of these practices already, but like an orienting practice, a body scan, grounding. We can even, there are certain experiential exercises that we can do. But anything that we can do to kind of try to bring people into the present moment. The therapeutic relationship is something that we can really use for this. Is like, what's going on? Maybe this person has brought up, we're discussing things about the past or the future. It's like, well, does that show up in here in our relationship? With experience, also, kind of making comments about what you notice in a person as they're talking to you in the present moment, and where you might hear sort of some movement towards flexibility in this process is, again, the noticing. So my mind can get so stuck on that. It makes me feel tense. So kind of an awareness of almost like there's like a coming to in the moment of like, wow, I just got really carried away. And an ability to actually describe sensation and emotion. Where do you feel that in your body? Where do you feel your anger? If that anger could say something, what would it say right now? Kind of things that are more present moment integrated focus. I don't know why this example came to mind. It's a little bit of a throwback, but home improvement, Tim Taylor would go into his backyard to the enigmatic Wilson, who I kind of remember would always sort of have a way of bringing Tim some like perspective and like ability to kind of like stop, you know, getting carried away with things. He was sort of this wise neighbor. I may be remembering that incorrectly, but for whatever reason, that's the association I had in my head. I think this is the last one of the inflexibility processes. So this is experiential avoidance, which is the core yearning of feeling. And this is where, you know, somebody that you're working with has real difficulty with feeling, and particularly this can be a real, like somebody who does a lot of pleasure seeking. We might see this with a lot of substance use, clinging to positive emotions, real avoidance of negative emotions. In ACT, there is a good deal of exposure work that would be related to experiential avoidance, where ACT exposure work differs from other exposure work is it's, again, not necessarily focused on distress reduction. What it's actually focused on is increased willingness and space for whatever comes up, the thoughts, the feelings, in the kind of exposure scenario. And what's more measured is the willingness and the ability to not try to soothe, as opposed to being able to you know, take the life affirming action no matter what shows up. So in session, you might hear, I've dealt with that already, no point talking about the past. So, you know, kind of real, like, no, we're not going to go there. Kind of difficulty talking about feelings. And anyways, I tell you that my sister got married, you know, kind of changing the subject when getting to something that's a little more difficult. And where difficulty taking compliments, you know, like compliments can be really difficult for people. And that it can kind of, you know, if you know, sort of say something that like brings about some positive, it means there's going to be some negative with it. A metaphor I like for this is that experiential avoidance, if you were to imagine that there's, let's say, you know, you're kind of like, you're in the street and there's, you know, sort of a little pothole, I guess. And I don't know, yeah, there's a little pothole and it's filled with water, you know, maybe it rained earlier in the day. And for whatever reason, you are insistent that there cannot be any water in this pothole. And so you are, you know, leaning over this pothole and you're scooping all the water out with your hands. That's all you have. You're just trying to like keep all the water out of this little pothole. Unfortunately, all that water is just going to flow back into the pothole because you don't really have a way of bringing it anywhere else. But so you kind of just have to sit there all day long, like trying to splash this water out of the pothole if you don't want to feel anything. So that in this metaphor, the water is your feelings. What that doesn't allow for you to do is to pay attention to the relationships in your life. Let's say somebody's calling you, you know, you're not able to like go ride your bike. You know, all of the things that make life worth living are kind of put to the wayside if you're kind of focusing on like, I cannot let this pothole fill up with water. I don't know what your motivation would be with the pothole specifically, but hopefully that metaphor captures something for you. A pivot around this as you help build space for emotions. So really even just, I mean, the act of being able to talk about emotions and sort of like feel them in the present moment in any form in the therapy room is, potentially going to help increase capacity for that. So you might hear, I'm feeling a lot of fear about going there. You might hear, again, like if somebody mentions like a behavior that sounds pretty different from what you're used to with them. I called my dad. It was hard, but I did it. It's like, wow, okay, so this person is opening up some capacity for feeling. Everyone's hero, Mr. Rogers. I feel like it's pretty self-explanatory around feelings, but just such a validating character in our lives of about feelings. So brief slide about ACT and other trauma interventions. So the nice thing about ACT is that it's, like I said, it's, to my knowledge, not really focused on any kind of manualization. This point here about functional contextualism, long story short, what that means is the truth of something lies in its function. So let me see if I can think of an example of that. Basically, if something is useful, that's awesome. So let's say that you're in the desert and all you've got on is like a nice pair of boots, and then you're really thirsty, and you see this, I don't know, little like spring bubbling up out of the desert, and you're like, well, guess I can't carry any water because I don't have a cup. And boots are only for feet. So that's not its use. Functional contextualism would say like a boot is only as good as its function. So this boot is now a cup, so it's very useful. I kind of just made that up on the fly. I hope that lands in some way. Working means building flexibility and vitality, not necessarily symptom reduction. So again, symptom reduction is not bad. It's not good. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But what we really want is, what symptom reduction matters if it is helping the person live a more flexible and vital life that's worth living. And so I've listed down here. I don't have too much experience with any of these except for CPT, but there are other models where, if any of you have experience with these, I'm sure that you were able to think of some examples of how the model that maybe you're more well-versed in can kind of overlap with acceptance and commitment therapy. And even some just like subtle differences in the kind of language that you use can, align what you're doing more with ACT if that's something that you're interested in. So with like CPT, for instance, or CBT, instead of saying like cognitive distortions or, like thinking about the facts of things, where we can just sort of look at like unhelpful thinking, or how helpful is this? And so there are ways to adapt a lot of other types of therapy to achieve some of the same end goals. I believe that you all will get this PowerPoint, and I hope that the hyperlinks are connected. Another really wonderful thing about ACT is that there are like a lot of just like completely free materials on the internet that I think are just great, like a lot of worksheets, but even kind of like full books. So I would highly encourage checking those out if you are interested. For the most part in this training, I used a book called Act Made Simple, which is really great. And then another one called Learning Act, which is also great, but a little more kind of in the weeds if you're getting really into ACT. There's also some good online trainings. So lots of resources out there. Here are the main resources referenced. If you want to check out, I don't know if any of you are members of the APA site, where they have kind of role or therapy sessions. This is the name of Grief Work with Acceptance and Commitment Therapy is the name of the video where you can see some ACT work. And that is all I've got for you.
Great. So we have a few questions, one of which you just answered with the resource guide. Anything else that you, Casey, that you'd recommend for getting into ACT stuff?
Let me see. There's a book called The Big Book of ACT Metaphors that is really fun. There's like 300 metaphors for like, I think it's useful for psychoeducation and just kind of helping some of the learning process, absorption in therapy. I'll just say, and I'm not affiliated with these at all, just as full disclaimer, but I did one training called ACT Immersion. It's by Steve Hayes. It's an online, like 10-part training that I thought was really great. That's available, relatively affordable for as far as like CEU kind of more intensive trainings go.
Someone just asked, do you use Kelly Wilson's The Wisdom to Know the Difference? And if so, how do you use it?
I think I have that book. I think that's a workbook having to do with the 12 steps. Is that right? I guess you maybe don't know the answer, Marcus. I think I have the book, but I do not believe that I've used it. I think that ACT is very, what I will say is I think it can connect really well to 12-step work. And particularly like some of the third step type stuff for those that are maybe more, acceptance is the answer is like a, very commonly mentioned thing in 12-step circles. So acceptance as a concept, I think, is very well linked to the 12-step world.
Questions? Okay, so nothing in the chat box. Any sort of questions or anything that anybody else would have that they'd want to throw out? Beautiful. Casey, any last sort of parting comments, thoughts? Someone just asked, do you combine ACT often with other work?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think other interventions, right? So, and that's kind of to the point of that last slide. I mean, I'm pretty new to acceptance and commitment therapy myself, but where I think I think it's highly adaptable, and it sort of it kind of just takes some like absorption of some of the ACT principles of like non-judgmental. Like there's a lot of real like mindfulness principles in it. So for instance, you know, it is very present moment focused. So I don't think it necessarily, like sometimes it doesn't necessarily like, it's not like an easy fit with some kind of, you know, maybe investigating like root causes of certain things. But again, like if you feel like something is going to be useful with your client and help them, like, so I'll give an example of something that I'm doing recently. It's like wanting to go back and talk about like a client's childhood. And I think that that could be useful for them to gain a more flexible perspective on the present, in order to be able to realize like, I did not always think this way, or I didn't always feel this way. So while that's not necessarily like strictly ACT work, I think it can kind of, in a roundabout way, achieve some of the same processes.
So if we have any last questions, feel free to ask them. We've got a few, we'll kind of give it a few more minutes, see if anybody has any struggling questions, but we won't do the weird social pressure thing to sit in silence until someone asks a question they're not actually interested in. So.
Well, I will say in the quiet moments, it looks like Casey folks really loved the videos, especially the second one, because some folks actually said they used that one.
Yeah, that is like, that's an awesome video.
And then there is a question. It says, you mentioned EMDR to integrate. In which way you'd integrate in ACT?
So I do not know much about EMDR. I don't feel, I guess I included that, maybe not thinking too fully about it, but I wish that I could actually kind of like flip that question on the person who asked. But I think that, from what I know about EMDR is, I think a lot of that work is, could fit into some of the perspective taking, sort of like it's experiential in the sense of like, I think that there's an exposure element to it, in that you, are finding a new way to experience feelings and process. So, I think if you are an EMDR practitioner, maybe looking at some of those core yearnings as like how EMDR maybe answers that, or kind of responds to some of those yearnings. But that's what I can think of off the top of my head.
And that same person said, I can see that ACT can be utilized in resourcing in EMDR.
Well, I think this was good training, and this is probably a little good starting point. So everybody could grab a cup of coffee to make a push for the last part of the day, I guess.
Yeah, thank you guys so much.
Yeah. Thanks to everyone for showing up, for attending, for being active and engaged. Thank you, Casey, for presenting, and thanks, Stacy, for helping organize and pull all this together.
Yeah. And everyone who's attending, make sure you look for that email with all of the links that you'll need. We'll get you the PowerPoint. We'll get you the links to the eval. We'll also give you Casey's contact information in case you have any questions that pop up afterwards that you didn't get a chance to ask, or maybe after you go back through the slides, you see something. But if not, we're going to call it a day. And again, thank you all so much for being here, and we'll see you next time.